Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. Thanks again for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please like, comment, and share in your favorite podcast app. And we'll keep sharing amazing conversations like the one we have for today. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. I'm also an investor in and advisor to more than 30 AI-first companies. And as you know, a firm believer in the power of technology to make humans better. If you're passionate about changing the world with AI, or maybe just looking for your next adventure, let's talk. We learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show. And the added bonus is you get one AI fun fact each week. Today's fun fact: this week in the MIT Technology Review, Melissa Heckela writes about why you shouldn't trust AI search engines. She describes how they're excellent at predicting the next word in a sentence, but they have no knowledge of what that sentence actually means. That makes it incredibly dangerous to combine them with search, where it's crucial to get the facts straight. Melissa details why high-profile failures by Microsoft's Bing and Google's Bard should surprise absolutely nobody. She argues that without true explainability via citations associated with generated content, we're inadvertently training a whole generation to over-rely on AI, even when it spews nonsense. As always, we'll link to the full article in today's show notes. But now, shifting to today's discussion. This time of year in the US, we are taping this in March of 2023. It's hard to not feel intimidated by the process of filing taxes. It's hard to know what changed in the tax code, and there's just constant anxiety about whether or not we've maximized deductions and we're getting the largest refund if we're owed one. Thankfully, we're joined by an expert today who is finally innovating in the tax planning space. Daniel Marcous comes to fintech from an unconventional background. Before co-founding April, he was the CTO for the Waze product at Google. That's, of course, the social traffic app originally called FreeMap Israel. It was acquired by Google in 2013 for $1.3 billion. Daniel started his career as a data scientist in the Israeli Defense Force and actively gives back to the Israeli data science community through involvement with DataHack, DataLearn, and Kaggle IL. Without further ado, Daniel, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. Let's get started by having you share a bit more about your background and how you get into the space.
Hey, Dan, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here. And throughout this talk, you'll see my excitement about taxes, which is not an obvious thing, but sort of an acquired taste, something we laugh about it here in April. So a little bit about my background to get us started. As you've mentioned it quite correctly, started in the Israeli Defense Force, where I did a lot of software engineering, specifically in the realms of big data and data science. It was around 2011, so it was fairly new. So a lot of exciting projects there. And then I started what you can say my first industry role at Google, which happened to be at Waze at the time. And I've spent around 8 years there and started my journey as an IC, as a data scientist specifically, then moved to doing some more data engineering, software engineering, data analysis, leading a team, then forming this group, which we call the Data Guild, and leading all of data and data science at Waze, and then assuming a CTO role and sort of forming the office of the CTO at Waze. Very interesting time. Really loved what I was doing there. Being in charge of technology of a really large scale app that impacts the everyday life of people. A lot of AI in the background as well in order to find the optimal routes for someone. So lots of fun there. Still have lots of friends doing that.
Daniel, you're Israeli, and you had an amazing role as the CTO of the Waze product in one of the foremost tech companies in the world. And so I got to say, it's a little bit of a head scratcher that you, of all people, ended up going into the boring world of taxes, US taxes, albeit, and leaving kind of the creature comforts of an amazing role at Google. What shall we say inspired you to shift gears?
Yeah. To be honest, I was quite surprised as well. So was my wife, but I just woke up one day and realized that my dream is doing taxes all day. No, I'm kidding. That's never happened. But as I said before, I was happy. I was doing interesting work in very large scale with a lot of impact. But I always had this thing back in my mind where I wanted to create an impact from scratch on my own, and doing something that has the possibility of impacting every single person, which mostly means consumer tech, something that can be really big. And then quite randomly through an introduction, I met my co-founder, Ben. And we started talking about this idea of April, and even before that, just about the problems in the American tax space. And that sort of ticked all of the right boxes for me. It had the mission and impact. So at Waze, I was really taking pride at saving people time. And in April, I can save them both time and money. So that's one thing which makes it exciting. It has the potential of affecting basically everyone, every citizen, every taxpayer, which is amazing. And it's a funny thing to say, but it's quite interesting. So when coming up with this idea and starting to research the existing tax ecosystem in the US and the tax law, I got into this rabbit hole of reading the entire individual tax code. And, I just wrapped my head around my head and I was like, why the hell does it work like that? I got to untangle it. And that's kind of complexity is something that I really like. So we have lots of tax geeks here in April that love the complexity of this problem. And another fun fact is that the experience in tech and the specific tech I was using when Waze and Google actually came into light in a surprising way here, which we can talk about later. But Waze basically is a navigation system, right? So you have this huge graph that represents all of the roads and you try to find the shortest path. And this is exactly how we look at the tax code. We imagine the tax code as this huge decision tree. And in order to optimize the tax refund or reduce the liability for them, we actually traverse this graph in an optimized manner that's personalized specifically for them.
So we're all familiar with tax planning software, QuickBooks and H&R Block, and kind of the way we've been doing things for a long time. I know that the April approach is to kind of make the tax planning process continuous and potentially even like embed tax planning in other fintech apps. So in light of what you just said about this kind of traversing the graph and finding the quickest path to navigate through this just bizarrely Byzantine web of regulations, why the approach to what does it even mean to embed tax planning in other apps?
Great question, Dan. So in order to answer that, I think I have to take a little step back and provide some background. So I'll start with a few facts on the financial services landscape in the US. So it starts with the fact that the average American has 3 to 5 financial apps on their phone in order to manage their finances. And those apps, what we see today, are competing to become these sort of hubs or super apps to manage all of Dan's finances in a single place. Now, the way April came into taxes is actually to think about where is this holistic data source of someone's financial profile that we can use in order to help you personalize your finances. And we realized that the missing piece there was taxes. And what April wants to be is not to add another app to Dan's phone, but to be this partner for the apps that you already have and offer this missing piece in the financial puzzle of making sure that you can also manage your taxes in the single place where you manage your other pieces of finance. If it's investments, loan, checking accounts, and so on. Now we're starting to go into the embedded way. And our philosophy, as you mentioned about taxes, is that taxes is not a one-time thing in April. If you reached April the month, not the company, right? If you reached April and you're here to do your taxes now and you haven't thought about everything throughout the year, it's by far too late to save you the big bucks. We can do some magic, and we are, in order to put the numbers in the right boxes in a way that will be most beneficial for you. But in order to make a dramatic impact, we need to be there when and where you actually make your financial decisions. And we realize that this place is your bank, your payroll, your personal finance management, and so on. And in order to be there, we're offering those embedded tax services to those companies, so we can have a part of it and we can give you the real-time tips and optimizations. Now, our business model in relation to that is what we call B2B2C, right? So we're offering tax services to our partners, which is, for example, a bank, and they can offer the tax services to their users, the people that are banking with them. Now, it makes sense, and the April business model, which is differentiated from the handful of existing tax engines out there that do not offer embedded services, is because April's mission is very well aligned with both the taxpayer and our financial partner. It's to save the user, the taxpayer, time and money. It's very different than the direct-to-consumer apps that exist out there, which are sort of walled gardens that try to keep you inside a single place. Do your taxes with me, also bank with me, put your deposit here. They also usually try and sort of celebrate the complexity of the process so they can upsell with manual human CPA support. And we're the opposite of that. Our main KPIs is to make this process as short and effective as possible. So we basically can take care of all this headache for you.
So I go into my banking app, and let's say it's it's not April, it's October. I'm really not thinking about taxes at all. What's my experience like? Do I know that I'm interacting with April, or what's different about, I'm just going to check my balance or do typical banking activities in the app?
Right. So we have multiple different options of implementation and integration, but let's start with the way that April imagines the user journey or their interaction with taxes. And we see three parts to it. The first part is tax estimation. So you won't be surprised next April and what's your tax liability or refund, but we'll be able to say in every day in the year, what's going to be your predicted refund or predicted tax liability based on your data. So every time you log in the app, you can see that, and you can see that something changed because you took a new loan, you switched jobs, you changed your withholding, and so on and so on. Now, the second part after that is using that estimate and your data to offer you optimization. And one example for that, which we're actually launching in the next few weeks, is payroll optimization. So the average tax refund in the US is around $3,000. What that means is that you're probably overpaying by a large amount your taxes, which you can think of as you're giving the IRS an interest-free loan for the rest of the year. What we can offer you is, hey, you know what, Dan? Your refund is going to be roughly $3,000 next year. Obviously, it's personalized based on the data that we see for you. And then say, if you change your withholding a little bit like this and that, and we'll take care of all of this process for you, then you can save more money in your paycheck in expense of a lower refund next year. And then all of that sort of funnels to the end of year filing process, where we already have some of your data from the interaction with you throughout the year, and we can remove a lot of the friction and make it a lot more seamless for you to file your taxes in an easy and confident manner.
So you are accustomed to capturing user data about, let's say, journeys, where they travel, things like that, from your Waze days, and using that to optimize routes. I'd imagine that the kinds of data that you're collecting to train models, do various kinds of work to improve the app, at April, it's much more sensitive. How do you think about the difference between how you behaved as a data scientist at Waze versus how you use data to make decisions and improve the experience at April?
Correct. That's a good observation. So at April, our approach basically is to look at the data as it's owned by the user. And our goal by collecting this data is, one, to collect the minimal amount of data that is required to do the regulatory activity of filing your taxes. We're actually trying to remove as much friction as possible. And by navigating this graph and finding the shortest path, we're removing redundant, unnecessary questions, things we can infer on our own. So we have the minimal amount of interaction and data collected, and not collecting anything that we don't need to know. Now, coming back to that same philosophy of saying the data is Dan's, is not really ours, our goal in using this data is to have Dan be able to take control of their finances. And instead of all of this data that you have to feel every year when you do your tax filing going into the abyss, we're going to help it come back and serve you in form of optimizations and ways for you to save money. So we look at it as sort of like a win-win between April, the taxpayer, and the partner. Because even if we partner with someone like a bank, let's say, that can offer loan and at an attractive terms that is better than the loan that you have today, we can sort of do this matchmaking between you and the bank to have a win-win between both them and our partner. So, and more than that, basically, tax industry or tax software industry as a whole is a super regulated industry. And April, as an IRS-approved software provider, has to go through a lot of tests and regulations in order to be compliant and hold ourselves and to be held by the IRS to the maximal degree of security, privacy. There's a lot of things that you cannot do or can do only with very specific consents in terms of taxpayer data. And we take it with the utmost respect to the user data, basically.
Do you have that IRS authorization today?
Yeah, we do. It's an interesting thing, actually. One of the strategic decisions that we made early in our process and ideation and then building April is that we're not going to sort of sublease one of the handful of existing tax engines that are out there, all of those from the 90s mostly, because when we did our research, we realized that the way this tax engine and the interaction with the IRS and the tax authorities work dramatically impacts what you can do UX-wise to the user. So instead of us developing something that's a form-based product, which is sort of a digitization of all of the paper forms that you have and just asking you those questions in a web browser instead of on paper, we've decided to do something different and talk directly to the IRS and the tax jurisdictions, process and analyze their schemas and data mappings using natural language processing, and then funnel that into a single user profile, which is an holistic picture of your financial situation. So we can remove as much friction as possible, speak at a human language, not ask you things that you would then need to go to Google and search for in order to understand how to answer this question, and sort of hide this complexity from the user. And we wouldn't have been able to do that if we would have used some of the existing products.
The way you describe the challenge of traversing the tree to understand the tax code implies that it's deterministic. Are there other places in the software where you're using machine learning or where you're interpolating based on the data that you have?
Yeah, that's correct. So tax in general is based on law. So theoretically, it is deterministic, right? But there are a few nuances there where you have law, then the IRS actually translates the law from Congress into instructions on how to fill the forms. And sometimes those instructions are vague, and you can translate them into logic and calculations in your software this way or another. And obviously, we want to benefit with the taxpayers. So while some of these calculations and translations are very straightforward, some of which requires what's called a tax position, which you have to take in order to decide how you want to treat this law. And we use that with an approach that we call collaborative AI. So it's an approach that's usually referred to in the literature as when you take the benefits of AI, in our case, a lot of computer vision and natural language processing to read the tax law and the tax documents and process them, and the advantages of domain experts that tune and tweak the system, which in our case are tax pros that are employed by April, and sort of QA the software, do this tax positioning thing, and optimize the specifics of hard use cases. Now, in order to actually use the advantages and the strengths of both, you need some sort of system for them to interact with. So you have to build this back office system, which in April we call the April OS, as in April operating system, which is a visual interface that shows this huge decision tree in a visual manner. And its users are the tax pros that tweak it, tune it, QA it, and make sure that it's all correct. As tax law and tax computation, even like in our case, when they're generated mostly with a machine by NLP reading the tax law and translating it into code, it needs to be 100% accurate when you file it to the IRS. So we can't have something like, ChatGPT, which is 100% of the time very sure at what it's saying, but not always saying the right thing, output someone's taxes without checking the logic. So it has to be a collaborative manner there.
That's why I asked, because if you're using personalization or any kind of AI or machine learning, the cost of a false positive is really high potentially. It could result in IRS penalties, various kinds of repercussions. Presumably, the cost of a false negative really isn't that high because they're no worse off than what would have happened otherwise. How do you, when you are using features that involve some kind of personalization or machine learning, how do you think about the trade-offs between a false positive, giving a wrong answer, and a false negative, not giving an answer at all?
Yeah, we have internal processes in-house to test our software, test the personalization, and test the outputted code. And those tests happen at many different levels. They happen in the single rule or single calculation and box level, sort of like unit tests in software. Then they happen on the persona level, sort of like integration tests, when we make up the persona for Dan, make up the persona for Daniel, for Josie, and so on, all with their tax data. And we run it through the software and we see the output and we manually verify it that it is 100% correct. After that, we also have the tests that are performed by the IRS and the state jurisdictions. They actually don't approve anyone to be official software providers until they pass tests. So they also give them those personas that they make up, and they say, okay, please submit the taxes for them. Let me check that it's actually the right thing. So there's a lot of checks and balances in the way to make sure that we're accurate. And again, it's super important. We make sure that nothing falls between the cracks here, is that it's not really something they can make mistakes on. We think of tax software as something like NASA, right? Like it's not another level of other consumer software that then you can like, oh yeah, well, you make a right turn here instead of there. It will cost you a minute or two. It's people finances. It's very, very sensitive. It's very regulated. It's also makes people very anxious, right? So we don't really want to make any mistake, even if it's a small one, because the cost of it, where the IRS comes to someone and says, hey, Dan, you know what? You owe us $100 more, more than what April said you are. We cannot afford that.
So we're having this conversation about the complexity of software to be able to understand or interpret the complexity of the tax code. What if instead, I wonder if this is the wrong conversation we should be having. Maybe the problem is the complexity of the tax code. If you were in charge of the IRS, what's one thing that you would do just to make it easier on tax filers to be able to, just manage the complexity without having to be a tax expert like you?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I have to say that's the first time I'm being asked that. So it will take me a while to come up with an answer, but I have to say that on the very superficial level, people always talk about simplification of the tax code. Now, I want to try and explain a little bit why this is not that easy and not necessarily even the right thing to do. So we have to first understand that tax code is law, as we said before, and law is political, which is very interesting. As you can see, a lot of politics and a lot of changes in the tax law that change every different administration, and a lot of benefits that you give specific constituents in a specific location because that person at that time was chosen to Senate and they wanted to benefit with their constituents. Now, the individual tax law exists for more than a century. You can find individual tax forms from the first one from 1864 and then from 1913 and forward in a more structured manner. And what happened because of all of the new laws and changes is that you have this sort of patched system that benefits with many, many different populations. So every time you add more patches and you add more edge cases and you benefit with more people. So trying to simplify all of it, even if you start from scratch, it will probably be nicer, but given the very many different jurisdictions, financial instruments in the US and the advanced economic system, you will still end up with something super complex. Now, what you can do to benefit with the taxpayer is sort of providing a way to look into this black box with more explainability, simulation, like what if tools. Okay, what if I change this or that? What if I take this or that loan? How does it change my tax situation, my tax liability? And then the next level on top of it is optimization. And while those tools do not exist or are not provided by the IRS today, this is sort of the gap that April is trying to facilitate for. Building those top level tools on top of the complex tax code, so you won't have to know about the complexity.
Which makes it a good opportunity for April, because what you're saying, somewhat cynically, is that the tax code is not going to uncomplicate itself.
Probably not, unfortunately.
Now, Daniel, this is AI and the future of work. And so I got to ask you this question. As tools like April become the predominant way to navigate the tax system and file taxes, is there a time, a decade, 2 decades out, when we can automate away the role of the CPA?
Mm-hmm. This is a very loaded topic that we are dealing with and we are thinking about. And I'll give some background before I jump to my answer. And some of this background, which is important for the audience to know when we're talking about it, is that if you look at population surveys and surveys around people's professions, you see that there's a very large drop in the number of CPAs in relation to the growth of the population in the last decade or so, which creates a huge gap of CPAs that people need. It's because of the tax complexity, it's a service that people need, someone to take care of your taxes for you. And what happens because of this decline in the number of CPAs, that the existing ones tend to go up market, offer their services to the more financially wealthy and the more complex use cases. And for the average Josie, they're gonna get a very expensive one size fits all service that's probably not gonna optimize with her, not gonna fit her needs, and she's just gonna pay an obscene amount for it. So she's not gonna use it. Now, when this gap is formed, what April is trying to do is to fill it with a personalized service that can benefit everyone and sort of bring back down this services of the wealthy to the masses, this tax planning and optimization. Now, even if you look at CPAs and what they do, it's hard to, like, people don't usually think about it, but you probably imagine a CPA sitting with their pencil and papers and doing some sort of calculations, but it's 2023, right? The CPAs use software. They don't just calculate numbers with their calculator. They also use software and they punch numbers in the software, but they do it in a smart manner. And they have because they know the tax system, they have the ability to come up with more simulations and more way to input this data to benefit with the people they interact with. Now, when you think about this future of CPAs and what individuals will do, you can sort of think of the equivalent of autonomous driving, basically, right? Saying, will self-driving cars eliminate drivers? So maybe in the next few decades, they somewhat will, or they will dramatically remove the number of drivers in the population, but they will open the ability for those people to do something different, which is more creative and more interesting, like being a tour guide, right? So when you drive and you have someone with you say, hey, you know what, this restaurant is good, you should stop here. That's exactly what the more advanced CPAs do. They help you navigate your finances and your financial journey. They're not there to just do the manual work of driving you or filing your taxes. They're there to do the creative part on how to optimize your finances in a personalized manner. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. We will just help give them more tools to make it more efficient from them.
Daniel, there are a bunch of CPAs listening that just breathed a big sigh of relief. It's probably like maybe like restaurants, right? I mean, it's really easy to DoorDash my meal, but there's something about the experience of being waited on and you know, the food preparation and the ambiance and the memories that you can't really replicate the experience of eating in a restaurant by having food delivered home, right?
Exactly. And at April, we also really take pride in being what we think is one of the most interesting places for a CPA to work at. One of those companies where the CPAs sort of monitor the system and add their creative added value on how to sort of fine tune and massage this tax decision tree.
Makes sense. Daniel, we are about out of time, but I'm not letting you off the hot seat without answering one last very important question for me. I happen to know that you're a bit of a mixologist, so you gotta tell the audience. So
that's correct.
Your favorite cocktail, and you know, maybe some concoction that you've made that you're most proud of.
That's correct. That's a hobby I have, which I tend to spend too much time doing. But actually the opposite of complex and fancy. I'd say my favorite cocktail is still a classic martini. Now, you have a lot of ways of doing that and bringing that to perfection, but the three ingredients that you need is London dry gin, dry vermouth, and bitters, and you can go crazy with the mix and the ratios of all three. So you have so many different drinks out of those three combinations, which you can call a martini.
Well, I'm going to link to the gallery of your of your concoctions in the show notes because it's beautiful. It is museum quality, and you're an artist, my friend.
Thank you. I try my best in between reading tax law to have a sip once in a while.
It's important. Certainly, martinis will help the reading of tax laws make it a little easier. Well, good, yeah, Daniel. We're out of time, but where can our audience learn more about you and the work that you're doing?
So I welcome the audience to go and check out our website. That's www.getapril.com. There's lots of information there for users, partners, developers, and so on. And feel free to reach out to me directly in LinkedIn. Daniel Marcous, happy to geek out about taxes with anyone, anytime.
Brilliant. Well, Daniel, this was so much fun. Thanks for hanging out.
Thank you so much, Dan. I enjoyed it.
Well, that's all the time we have this week on AI and the future of work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin. And of course, we're back next week with another fascinating guest.